All right, so welcome to Module 2 of Social Work 793. Again, this is going to be the module where we start getting a little bit more into the online discussion. In a typical online or typical in-class discussion section, we would be doing small group activities, but since this is online, obviously we can't do that, so I'm going to try to emulate that via a virtual discussion forum. So again, please stay active in that because it's really important to your learning throughout the semester. So if you have any questions or announcements that you'd like to post, feel free to start new threads, respond to other people's questions. And chances are if you have a question about the course, there's going to be somebody else who has the same exact questions going on. Your assignment for the previous module was to read the prologue. There's going to be an online discussion post about that, so please remember to do that before the end of the module. Again, along with practice evaluation, points of comparisons, and we're going to get into an introduction to measurement today. So let's get right into it. All right, so from the prologue, some questions are what you found to be helpful, examples, any examples of collecting client consumer data from pre-existing sources, and what were these examples? What might be some other examples of existing data sources that an agency could use? And also, what's the organization's responsibility to use practice evaluation? I'd like for you to answer these questions in the discussion forum and provide any general feedback that you have for me or your classmates about the prologue. All right, so some highlights from the prologue are that social workers do have a responsibility to perform a practice evaluation. So this can be something really simple, just asking a client to fill out a valid and reliable evaluation of their desired outcome or operationally defined problem. Also, social workers should share their practice and evaluation ideas with their clients. So why do you think this might be helpful? Generally, it helps to build rapport, but also it helps the client to feel that they're empowered in their decision making. So as opposed to just giving them ideas of what you think they should be doing, by really asking them to give their feedback and how they think that their treatment should be going, really helps them to feel a little bit more empowered and gives them some say. So by giving them some options, it helps them to stay motivated and, again, helps them to be a little bit more invested in their treatment. So another highlight, I talked about this last module, but practice evaluation does require a little bit of extra time, but once you get a hang of it, it really isn't going to be that much more than you typically would be putting into your regular practice. And also, by that little bit of extra time, you're going to be really improving the outcomes of your practice, making sure that you're getting the outcomes that you want, and really helping the client to feel valued and empowered. So from the prologue, one thing that you might have talked about was that evaluation can be streamlined by looking at pre-existing sources of data. So there was an example from the prologue that you could talk about in your discussion post. So as opposed to you collecting a full baseline prior to your intervention, sometimes the baseline's collected for you already. All right, so another highlight is that social workers need to know the difference between practical versus statistical significance. When we're thinking about statistical significance, it's ultimately a measure of whether or not the change could have occurred by chance alone. And we've got statistical methods that we'll get into a little bit later in the semester. I know a lot of people freak out when they hear the word statistics, like it's the worst thing ever. But really, it's not too bad, especially for this course. You'll be able to get through easily. I've been teaching this for a long time, and I've never really had anybody have an issue with the stats that we're doing here. But what's meant by practical significance? Ultimately, that's if a client reaches the goals that they're trying to achieve. So maybe what might not have reached the level of statistical significance, if it's making a real impact in their life and they feel that they've reached the level of change that they wanted to, that's practical significance and something that should be celebrated. Other points of comparison that's really important to bring up with practice evaluation to different types of evaluation. So what's the difference between experimental design versus single system design? Again, with an experimental design, we've got one group compared to another, or one person compared to another. But in single system design, we're taking one person or one system, repeatedly measuring them at baseline and comparing that to their intervention phase to really figure out if we're having the impact that we would really like to have. So in natural science, measurement's pretty easy, right? I can look at my height, and you probably won't interact with me, but I'm 6'6", so I know this because I can use 10 different tape measures and they're all going to give me the same result. But in social sciences, we don't have gold standards, quite like we do in natural sciences. So you could take somebody's measurement with an intelligence test today, and hopefully you'll get the same response a year or two from now, but there's going to be a little bit more fluctuation than if you were to take somebody's height now and 2 years from now. So with measurement, scientists take major steps to ensure the validity and reliability of measures that they're creating for social sciences. But all of them have a little bit of error built into them, so we're trying to figure out the measurements that have the least amount of error that are going to give us the most accurate results. And so for this course, the first thing that we're going to be doing is coming up with a conceptual definition of a client's problem. So a conceptual definition includes concepts such as clinical depression, alcoholism, triangulation, volunteerism. So where would we go to look for some of these definitions? One place that you could look at is the DSM-5. So the DSM-5 is kind of like the clinical Bible of psychopathology. So this would be a good place to look up a conceptual definition. So we could look up substance abuse, depression, and here we would have definitions of what you would have to meet to get the diagnostic criteria for depression or substance abuse. We could also look at literature and social welfare. We could look at textbooks trying to figure out conceptual definitions. But this isn't necessarily talking exactly how we're going to be measuring it yet. So this is just looking at what the concept is and trying to define what the problem is that we're looking at. So for instance, with triangulation, that's something that's going to be a little bit harder to put a measuring tape to. So we have to first have a good conceptual definition of what it is. So an example for a conceptual definition is clinical depression is a mood disturbance of depressed mood, feelings of emptiness or sadness, and a loss of interest in pleasurable activities. And that's from the DSM-4 TR, the previous DSM. But here we don't have anything about number of behaviors occurring. This is just what the behaviors are. So these are indicators of somebody having clinical depression. Likewise, alcoholism is a disease that includes cravings, loss of control, physical dependence, and tolerance. This one is from the National Institute of Alcoholism. And again, this one doesn't really have anything about measurement in it. Triangulation occurs when one member of a dyad seeks a third party as an ally for their position. And if any of you out there are married, maybe you've been pulled in triangulation before. I don't know if maybe my sister-in-law and my wife have been plotting against me. Hopefully not, but that would be an example of triangulation. Something a little bit more simple, volunteerism, consists of acting freely or actions freely taken by individuals, groups, or organizations that benefit larger society. And lastly, elder mistreatment by caregivers occurs when responsible caregivers either physically or verbally abuse or neglect an elderly individual. So that's a straightforward concept, but what that looks like in practice is a mean joke about an elderly person, abuse. It's mistreatment, but when does mistreatment cross over to abuse, and what would we say is elderly abuse? We need a good conceptual definition before we can actually move into measuring these types of things. All right, so once we've got our conceptual definition down, that's when we can move into the operational definition. So once we've defined what it is that we're trying to look at, now we can put a measuring tape to it. So an operational definition allows the concept to be measured in terms of specific number of thoughts, feelings, or actions. If we were going to be looking at something in natural science, maybe head circumference. We could take a measuring tape and I could measure my head circumference, and that would be really easy to do, right? But when we're trying to get into something that's going on inside of our heads, such as thoughts, feelings, that can be a little bit more tricky. Perfect example, depression. It's really hard to put a tape measure to depression, but what we can do is measure the number of negative thoughts somebody's having. So for this example is the number of days in a 2-week period that Janet feels depressed most of the day. So here we've got two important components of the operational definition. The number of days within a 2-week period. Is it 1 day? Is it 2 days? And we've also got the larger frame of the 2 weeks. So we couldn't just say the number of days Janet feels depressed most of the day, because within what period? Is it the number of days within a month? Is it the number of days within a year? And depending on what our specifier is, The number of days is really meaningless. So we have to have two components of an operational definition. One, the number of times a behavior occurs, and secondly, within a specified time period. So another example of operationally defining depression is Charlie's score on the Beck Depression Inventory. So the Beck Depression Inventory is a standardized measure of depression. It's valid, reliable. We pretty much know this through multiple scientific practices and research. So an operational definition of triangulation could be the number of times each week Phil calls his brother after an argument with Sandy. So this would be if Phil is trying to drag his brother into a triangulation situation to team up against Sandy, the unfortunate victim of triangulation. Here we've got number of calls within a specified time of 1 week. Where can we find these conceptual definitions? We can find them in the DSM, we can find them on social work websites, we can find them in a dictionary. But operational definitions are a little bit harder to come up with. So what could be some things that make these difficult? One thing is that we have to specify exactly the behavior that we're trying to measure. So how many drinks somebody had last night? Well, how are we going to find what a drink is? Is a 12-ounce full-strength beer a drink? Yes, that would be considered a standard drink. But what if somebody defined a drink as cognac, neat, glass to the top? That's technically one drink to that person, right? But it's not a standard drink. So we'd have to specify what exactly the standard drink was. Is it 4 ounces of wine, 12 ounces of beer, 1.5 ounces of hard liquor? So we'd have to specify exactly what that behavior was. So there's a couple different levels of measurement that it's important for you to know. One, nominal level. So it's a classification system that's categorical with variables and subclasses. So gender, male, female, could be race, marital status, married, single, divorced, widowed. All of these could be nominal status categories or levels of measurement. So second level of measurement is ordinal. So variables have different values and values that have a specific quantitative measure or meaning. So very satisfied, moderately satisfied, not satisfied, very unsatisfied. All of these variables make sense within the order in which they're placed. Intervals also have different values that are equidistant. So IQ could be one. Standard IQ, high intelligence is one standard deviation above 100. Intervals could be grades. 90% is an A, 80% is a B. These are all examples of interval. And then ratios, the only difference between interval and a ratio is that ratio has a fixed absolute 0 point. Number of times you saw your social worker last week. And so I'm going to wrap up this module with a little bit of a talk of reliability and validity, but we're going to hit harder on this next module. So for your discussion post, I'd like for you to try to take a stab at how a piece of rubber band and a dartboard can help distinguish between the concepts of reliability and measurement validity. Here's a visual example of that. But again, from your reading and hopefully from 662 or previous courses you've taken, reliability refers to the consistency of a measurement. So a measure's ability to give you consistent results over time. But validity refers to the accuracy of a measure. So if looking at this table, we can see on the top left, unreliable, invalid. So none of these are hitting the bullseye, and they're not even hitting in the consistent place. But if we look at the top right, we can see something that's unreliable but valid because it's hitting the bullseye but not consistently. So every once in a while it's accurate, but not always. Kind of like if you've heard the broken clock analogy, it's right 2 times a day, right? But all the rest of the time it's off. So if a measurement is reliable but not valid, that's not really doing us any good either. So an example of that could be taking my intelligence by my head circumference. So if I took my head circumference today and I took it next week, it's going to be reliable because it's going to be the same head circumference every time. But it's got nothing to do with my intelligence, right? So it's reliable, but it's not valid. But what we're shooting for is the bottom right here, something that's going to give us consistent results and accurate results. It's going to hit the bullseye 100% of the time. So if you have any questions or comments, please post them to the discussion board, and stay tuned for next week.